Due to injury, the Orioles bullpen went without Danny Coulombe for about 3 months this year. And for those 3 months, it wasn't a very good pen. Showed you how important Danny Coulombe really is. So should the Orioles bring him back next year? And can he keep this up in his age 35 season? We'll try to answer those questions and recap Coulombe's 2024 season coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Wednesday, October 30th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are going to continue our Orioles 2024 player season review series as we go through pretty much every player on the 40-man roster and give them each their own episode breaking down their season. We talk about what went right, what went wrong, and the biggest storyline heading into the offseason and then into 2025. And today we will talk about left-handed reliever Danny Coulombe, how he was pretty much just as good in the first couple of months, how he ended up getting injured with the elbow pain. He missed a lot of time, how much the Orioles missed him. And then we'll talk about his offseason. He's got a team option coming up. He just turned 35. What can the Orioles ask from Coulombe moving forward? That's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So we're going to talk about Danny Coulombe and recap his 2024 season. And it was one that I'm sure Coulombe is not going to look back on completely fondly. And that is because he missed a good chunk of time with an elbow injury. And we will get to that. But of course, we want to start with what went right for Danny Coulombe this season. Really what went right is he's still not walking guys. And he lowered his walk rate really even more in 2024 with a 4.7% walk rate. That was the lowest of his career. You combine it with a 29.9% strikeout rate, the highest of his career, and you get a really, really good combination for a reliever. Now, just to put this off the top, we're going to be talking about a lot of small sample sizes here in this Coulombe episode, not just because he is a reliever and they tend to have smaller sample sizes, but also because he missed 3 months with an elbow injury and basically was only able to pitch half a season. Coulombe threw a career-high 51 and a third innings in his first year with the Orioles back in 2023 and posted a 2.81 ERA. Because of that injury, he threw only 29 and two-thirds innings over 33 appearances in the regular season for the Orioles this year. Now, they were really effective, 29 and two-thirds innings. He had a 2.12 ERA with a 2.83 FIP. He ended up, as I mentioned, 29.9% strikeout rate, 4.7% walk rate. Those are both career bests. Opponents hit just 147 against Danny Coulombe this year. Talk about the walk rate of 4.7%. That was the lowest among Orioles relievers and among MLB relievers who threw at least 20 innings. You're really opening up the space here to guys who threw 20 innings or more. Coulombe was 22nd lowest in baseball of all relievers across 30 teams with that 4.7% walk rate. That's pretty impressive. And here's the thing, the Orioles weren't horrible in the walk department, but they were below league average as a bullpen, or I guess you could say above league. They were worse than league average when it comes to their walk rate as a bullpen. It was an issue at times this year, and they really did miss Danny Coulombe in that spot. And also when you combine what he did with the walks with what he did with the strikeouts, which was really impressive for a guy who throws a fastball at 90 miles an hour to strike out about 30% of the hitters that you're facing, that's a pretty incredible accomplishment, to be honest. And his strikeout minus walk percentage was 25.2%. That was 19th best among all big league relievers who threw at least 20 innings. It's basically that combination is exactly what you want out of a relief pitcher. And when you combine it with the fact that it's a lefty, which can make it better. And again, he's throwing what? When he really gears up on a fastball, he might touch 92. So to have that stuff and still be that good is why Danny Coulombe really wows me at any time. And honestly, if you told me name your 5 favorite players to watch play for the Orioles, pitchers, hitters, whatever, I think Danny Coulombe would be in that top 5 just to watch him flummox hitters with the stuff that he has. Now, the other thing that went right again is guys really still are not fully barreling Danny Coulombe up, and that really helps him just have success on the mound as well. His 5.7% barrel rate that he allowed, only CNL Perez had a better barrel rate allowed among Orioles relievers this year, and we know Perez just plays off of, hey, everything is a ground ball, so it's hard to barrel him up. And also, for Danny Coulombe, 47.1% ground ball rate. I mean, that's not Yennier Cano, who's, you pushing 60+%. It's not CNL Perez, but it's kind of right behind those guys in terms of how many ground balls he's getting. That's a really good rate. And I mentioned it already. Opponents hit 147 against Coulombe this year. Like, yeah, he was injured, and yeah, it was only 33 total appearances out of the bullpen. But it is hard to hold big league hitters to 147. Again, among major league relievers who threw at least 20 innings, a 147 batting average against the 7th lowest of all big league relievers this year. I mean, to put it in perspective, I know Emmanuel Clase had his struggles in the postseason, but no doubt about it, Emmanuel Clase, the Guardians closer, was the best reliever in baseball this season. He was one spot behind Coulombe. Opponents hit 151 against him. That really puts into perspective how hard it was to just get hits against Danny Coulombe this year. And it wasn't like it was a lot of smoke and mirrors. Like, yes, his expected batting average against of 213 is certainly higher than the actual batting average. But when you look at the expected stats, it's hard to have an expected batting average against you that is under 200. 213 is still a really, really low number for that statistic as well. And then also, like, you talk about, okay, how does he do it? I keep mentioning he throws 90, 91. Well, the kitchen sink approach is still working for Danny Coulombe. And if you are watching here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube page, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Kind of throwing up here the Danny Coulombe pitch mix with statistics. This is courtesy of StatCast and Baseball Savant. And you can see, it's a little small on the screen, but you can see the cutter, really the only pitch that guys did any kind of damage off of. Opponents hit 219 against his cutter this year, which is his number one pitch. He throws it about 30% of the time. That was the only pitch that guys hit over 200. In fact, the second most well-hit pitch was his sinker. Opponents hit 133 against that pitch. He has success with basically everything still out there. The sweeper was still his good swing and miss pitch, which is great to see. And that was well up over 30% on his whiff rate. Like, everything, pretty much everything was kind of working. And the fact that he has that kitchen sink approach, it allows him to get not just lefties out, which he's good at, it allows him to get righties out. And actually, although righties hit for a higher average this year against Coulombe, which you would expect, if you look at the WOBA, if you look at the more full-fledged stats, righties were actually a little worse in general, just as overall hitters against Danny Coulombe this year than lefties were. And when you play into the fact that it was small sample, I think you can say he's not a guy who has heavy splits. If you throw him out there, I mean, this is why Brandon Hyde loves Danny Coulombe so much, because because the way his stuff plays, you're going to try to target left-handers and a big patch of lefties. But if you throw Coulombe out there, say it's lefty, righty, lefty, due up in the middle of the order, and they throw a right-handed pinch hitter out there, you're not worried. If it's lefty, righty, righty, Coulombe is still going to mow through those guys because the stuff plays so well. The curveball running down and in on righties, they can't hit it at all. It is just such a good mix of stuff to get lefties and get righties out. And I mean, on top of all of it, like, from everything I have heard from people in that room, Danny Coulombe is one of, if not the nicest guy in that Orioles clubhouse. Like, everybody loves Danny Coulombe. Obviously been a great on-the-field addition since the Orioles basically picked him up for nothing. It was a minor waiver claim trade for cash right before opening day in 2023 when the Twins basically told him, hey, you're not going to make our opening day roster. The Orioles said, thank you very much, and grabbed him for nothing. And since then, he has been like a huge part of this Orioles team on the field, of course, but just one of the more genuine people in that clubhouse, it seems, as well. And that is always great stuff to have on your team as well. But not everything was amazing for Danny Coulombe. Despite, I mean, you post a 2.12 ERA, you are generally feeling pretty good about yourself. However, when you only pitch 33 times in a season as a high leverage reliever, that usually means something went wrong. What went wrong was Well, an injury kept him out for basically half of this season. And even when he was out there was a couple of things under the radar that were a little shakier for Coulombe in 2024. We will break them all down, talking about what went wrong for Danny in 2024, coming up after this. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Prize Picks. Now, what is Prize Picks? Well, it is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. How do you play it? Well, you just pick more or less. That's right, more or less. You got to make one decision, either more or less. It's not tough math. They're not tough decisions. You make your entries in like 60 seconds. You do it on at least two players in football, in baseball, in basketball, in hockey, whatever it may be. And you've got a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. You can run your game all season long on Prize Picks. And 100 times your cash, little as 4 correct picks can get it done. And maybe you're looking at, okay, how am I going to make these selections? You can look at something like Patrick Mahomes. Might have something like more or less 267 and a half passing yards. That's all you got to do. Pick more or less. It's that easy. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That is at Prize Picks. Run your game. So we are breaking down the 2024 season for Orioles left-handed reliever Danny Coulombe. We've already talked about what went right for him this year. Now let's talk about what went wrong. And the gigantic elephant in the room for what went wrong for Danny Coulombe is that he got injured again. Third consecutive season in which Coulombe has had a stint on the injured list. Now, not completely out of the question for most pitchers. A lot of pitchers get injured. That is the state of baseball. But he missed a good amount of time this season. He was officially placed on the injured list on June 11th. It was actually retroactive to June 9th with elbow inflammation. That is not an injury that you want to hear for an important pitcher because generally things like forearm tightness and elbow inflammation will lead to much worse things that lead to much worse surgeries that lead to guys missing 12 to 18 months. However, it was like a little bit after the injury, Danny Coulombe spoke to the media and was basically like, yeah, my elbow's injured, but it's not what you guys think. And that told us, okay, it's not Tommy John surgery. That was nice to know, but we still didn't really know at that point in mid-June how long are the Orioles going to be without the guy who I said it at the time and said it throughout the season. I think when he got injured, he was the Orioles' best reliever at that point with, Felix Bautista out for the entirety of that season. It felt like Coulombe was the Orioles' best reliever and they just lost him for an indefinite amount of time. And you thought maybe a month or two we'll see. It actually ended up being a little bit more. He did not return until September 20th, missed over 3 months after he ended up getting surgery to remove some bone chips after that swelling came down in his elbow, was able to rest it, rehab it, pitch in some rehab games, and then get back on the big league mound. Now, it's not like he pitched a lot on the big league mound down the stretch. Again, he came back September 20th. He was able to throw 3 2/3 innings. Now, he did it scoreless, and he did throw 1 scoreless outing of 2/3 innings in the playoffs as well. So he came back right at the end and did help this Orioles bullpen a bit. But you could even tell when he came back, like he was not exactly the full Danny Coulombe when he did come back. I mean, his velocities, his spin rates on every pitch were down across the board. He was still effective because the stuff's that good. And again, didn't give up a run after he came back in late September, but there's a little bit of questions like, okay, is he fully going to be back for next year? But it was also an issue for the Orioles bullpen because the O's bullpen before his injury, so from opening day through June 8th, basically the first 2 months and change of the season, the Orioles with Danny Coulombe in there, even without Felix Bautista, even with Yennier Cano being not untouchable anymore, even with some other guys like Mike Baumann being in there and having some struggles, the Orioles had a 3.38 team bullpen ERA. That was the 7th lowest in Major League Baseball. Now, in the stretch that Coulombe was out from June 9th through September 19th, just over 3 months, the Oriole bullpen had a 4.68 ERA. That was up by almost a run and a half. They were 25th in terms of bullpen ERA in Major League Baseball during that stretch. Now, it wasn't just the loss of Danny Coulombe that made them struggle in those 3 months. There were certainly other factors, But a big part of it was not having, again, who I argued was the best reliever in that pen. It really hurt the O's to not have him. And also just to not, even if you don't think he's the best reliever, I think it's easier to say he was at least the best lefty in that bullpen. And without their best lefty, Brandon Hyde had to mix and match more against those tough pockets of lefties. Cionel Perez had his moments, also really had his struggles. Keegan Aiken was great in low leverage. Then you try to put him in high leverage, and it wouldn't go so well. The O's went and got Gregory Soto to try and fix this issue, and although he finished strong, he was really, really bad in those first few outings after the trade. They just couldn't find the right mix that could give them the production that Coulombe was out of a left-hander. And again, it made it 3 straight seasons, the hip in 22, the bicep last year, the elbow this year, that has put him on the injury list for some amount of time. And the other thing that was a little concerning, and a little bit of this was after the injury, but again, there was only 4 innings of the 30 basically that came after the injury. This was mostly pre-injury in April and May. He started to get hit a little bit harder. Now, I mentioned the barrel rate is down. The difference between the barrel rate and the hard hit rate is the barrel rate has more to do with getting that perfect launch angle, perfectly squaring up that baseball, hitting a ball where it's going to end up on the trajectory potentially of being a home run. You can still hit a ball hard and not barrel it if you beat a ball hard into the ground, or you hit a really hard fly ball, but it's just got way too high of a launch angle and it ends up just being like a long fly out to left field or something like that. Coulombe was getting hit a lot harder. Now, he was still getting away with it because they were still high fly balls that stayed in the park. They were still a lot of hard hit ground balls that allowed him to get outs with the defense behind him. So it wasn't a lot of, those perfect barreled up line drives that go into the gap or go over the fence. However, Coulombe's whole thing was his low hard hit rate in 2023. I mean, that was not the entire thing, but that was a lot of it. Danny Coulombe had a 30.4% hard hit rate against him in 2023. That was in the 95th percentile of all pitchers in Major League Baseball last year. This year, it jumped to a 47.1% hard hit rate against him. Now, again, it's in about half the inning, so some of this could just be some smaller sample size stuff. But it's still a little concerning when, if he were qualified, again, only pitching 30 innings, he's not going to be qualified for these leaderboards, he would be bottom 20 in Major League Baseball in hard hit rate if he were qualified for that stat this year. And again, he didn't qualify for these leaderboards I'm going to mention next up as well, because he didn't pitch a whole lot this season because of injury. But if you look at the largest jumps for qualified pitchers from 2023 to 24 in terms of hard hit rate, this is a list you don't want to be on, because these are guys who were getting hit much harder this year than they were last year. The largest jump of any pitcher was Astros starter Hunter Brown, who ended up having actually a really good finish to his season, but was pretty bad in the first half for the Astros. His hard hit rate jumped 14.1% from 2023 to 24. Now, again, he was number 1 on the list, but that was only because Danny Coulombe didn't throw enough innings to qualify for this leaderboard. Coulombe's jumped 16.7% from last year to this year in his hard hit rate. That is a concerning jump. Again, if qualified, that would have been the largest jump of any pitcher in baseball in terms of their hard hit percentage allowed from last year to this year. Not a list you want to be on. And so you ask, okay, Connor, like, he still got guys out. He still had an ERA that was barely over 2. What was going on? The culprit was the cutter. I mentioned the cutter already. It was the only pitch the opponents hit over 200 against him this year. And again, it was his number 1 most used pitch. He threw it 30% of the time this year. Now, his usage was down. He was a heavy cutter guy last year. Threw his cutter 43% of the time. Last year, his second most used pitch, his sinker, he threw 18% of the time. So he loved that cutter because he could throw it for strikes against lefties, and then he could get it in on the hands of righties and get them to kind of just chop little soft ground balls that would turn into outs. Coulombe did that all the time in 2023. But I don't know if it was just maybe a loss of some of the command of that cutter, that certainly could have been the big issue. But that pitch was just not the same this season. The usage was down, as I mentioned, about 12%, but it was the new pitch for him last year. When Coulombe came to the Orioles from the Twins, he was a fastball, slider, changeup, curveball guy. Now, he had toyed around with a sweeper right at the end of his time with the Twins, but when he came to the Orioles, he and the O's wanted to split up his slider into 2 pitches, and that's what worked for him. So instead of having one slider, he had a longer, sweepier slider, which he called the sweeper. It was less velocity. It had much more break. And then he had a sharper slider, which basically was categorized as and acted like a cutter. So instead of that one slider he had in 22 with Minnesota that he threw about 83 miles an hour, he now had a cutter that he could command super well. He threw it all the time. That was at like 86 miles an hour. And then the sweeper was down at like 81, 82 miles an hour, and it broke more and he slowed it down. And that discrepancy allowed him to toy with hitters even more and have even more of that kitchen sink approach. But my guess is, and it's harder to look this up, but it's something I can follow up on as well, is that he maybe lost some of that cutter command in year 2 of throwing that pitch. Again, that is a pitch, that cutter, that he had basically never thrown in his career before joining the Orioles in 2023. And he had amazing command of it. And some of that went away. And you can see in how often guys were squaring up that pitch. Last year, although opponents did hit 250 against his cutter, it was basically all singles. They were hitting 250, but they were slugging only 300 against the cutter last year. Like, yeah, they might get some, dinky hits here and there, but he gave up 20 hits on the cutter last year and 18 were singles. Like, nobody was barreling that ball up. It had a 300 slugging percentage against it. It had an average exit velocity of 81 miles an hour against that cutter last year. That's basically soft contact every time. That's why it was such a good pitch. This year, yeah, opponents hit for a lower average, just 219 against the cutter, but the slugging was up to 469. 4 of the 7 extra base hits he allowed this year, the cutter. 2 of the 3 home runs he allowed this year, the cutter. Guys were all over that pitch, and the average exit velocity against his cutter by opposing hitters jumped from 81 miles an hour, which is super soft, usually an out, to 95.2 miles an hour. Remember, 95 mile per hour exit velocity is considered a hard hit ball. That was the average against Coulombe. So basically, if he threw a cutter and it was put in play, it was on average a hard hit ball. That is not what you want, especially for your most used pitch. Now, again, he cut down the usage this year, ended up throwing more sweepers and more fastballs, but it was still slightly by percentage his number 1 most used pitch, and it was not good. That thing was getting hit hard, and honestly, he was getting very lucky when he was throwing that cutter. Like, it was getting hit hard sometimes, and luckily for him, right at defenders to kind of keep him out of harm's way. Now, some of the issues could be small sample size just because of the injury. He didn't pitch as much this year. He threw 355 cutters last year. He only threw 140 this year. So you're not getting as full of a data set when you're looking at his cutter. But the usage also being down 12% tells me that he noticed something with that cutter. And if you look month to month, okay, April threw the cutter 37% of the time. It was his number 1 pitch. Guys only hit 143 against it, but they were hitting it hard. In May, cutter usage down to 31%. Guys hit 357 against it, just crushed that cutter in May. Then in June, now again, he only pitched for about a week in June before he got injured, but in June, he cut the cutter usage to 20%, and it was no longer his number 1 pitch. It was his 3rd most used pitch. And then in September, when he returned from the injury, the cutter usage went down to 19%, and it was then his 4th most used pitch between the sweeper, the sinker, and the 4-seamer. So the bad news here is he may have kind of lost his cutter. The good news is Coulombe realized fairly quickly in the season that that pitch was a problem and he needed to go to the other stuff more often. And that change in usage, he ended up throwing more sweepers and it ended up being his best pitch really in June. And then in September when he came back, he identified that and he still had success when making that change. And that is a really good part of this because, yeah, not having your go-to command called strike pitch is a bad thing, but to be able to adjust that on the fly in the middle of the season and still have success tells you a lot about the pitcher that Danny Coulombe could be. Now, one more thing that did go wrong in his season was he wasn't really missing bats as much. Like, yeah, Coulombe was big on the soft contact last year, but he also got a good amount of swings and misses to get him out of jams. And The cutter swing and miss rate went down a little bit. Everything on the cutter went down. But overall, he went from last year, a 34% chase rate, that's guys swinging at pitches out of the zone, and a 29% swing and miss rate. Those are both great numbers. He went down to a 28% chase rate and a 24% swing and miss rate. Those are more middle of the pack, if not below. And the biggest culprit was randomly his sinker. Usually think of a sinker as a pitch that you're looking to throw for a strike, you're looking to get a ground ball. Coulombe had a 29% whiff rate against his sinker last year. This year it was 7%. So something was different about that sinker where guys were just not swinging and missing anymore. Coulombe can still get away with missing bats if he's getting soft contact. But if he's getting a lot harder contact like we saw this year, it's hard to pitch with less bat missing. So he's got to be able to hone in one or the other, either get the whiffs back or get the low exit velocities back. Because if both don't come back over a full season, there could be some questions for him going into next year. And that's what I want to talk about in the final segment. What does Coulombe's 2025 look like? He's 35 years old now. And is he even back with the Orioles next year? We'll get to that to finish off the pod coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by GameTime. GameTime is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the GameTime app, they actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. And with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, GameTime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. Now, we're not buying any Orioles tickets right now. Unfortunately, I wish we were looking for Orioles World Series tickets at the moment. But hey, if you're in LA or if you're in New York, maybe still look for World Series tickets on GameTime. But hey, every day we're closer to March and we're closer to the Orioles season in 2025 beginning, and GameTime is going to be the place you want to go. But until then, they got hockey tickets, they got basketball tickets, they got football tickets, they also got theater tickets, they got comedy tickets, concerts, whatever you want. GameTime's got it. And with GameTime picks, curation, it makes it easier to save more on all of those events. They even have these flash deals where you go in the app at the right time, boom, you save money. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets and more with GameTime picks. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download GameTime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So to finish things off today, as we recap Danny Coulombe's 2024 season with the Orioles, we talk about his biggest storyline heading into the offseason and into 2025. And the biggest storyline is, will the Orioles bring him back? He, like a couple of other players, Sir Anthony Dominguez and Ryan O'Hearn, have a team option tacked on to the end of his deal. So Coulombe, who was initially slated to be a free agent after this season, the Orioles, when they went to arbitration with him last offseason, tacked on an extra year of a club option to his deal, which would be $4 million for the 2025 season. What that means is the Orioles, for about a week after the World Series ends, they have a choice to make. They can either A, pick up the team option, which means Coulombe would be back with the O's for 2025. They'd pay him $4 million, and then he would become a free agent after next year. Or they can decline the option, which basically means he becomes a free agent this offseason. Now, the first thing I'll say is they better pick up a $4 million option on Danny Coulombe, even with the injuries, even with him missing 3+ months this year with an elbow issue, which wasn't UCL, wasn't Tommy John, it was bone chips, but still elbow issue, and a guy who a couple of days ago, October 26th, turned 35 years old. That makes you shudder a little bit. But for $4 million, especially with David Rubenstein now taking over, $4 million for a guy who had an ERA around 2 and was a guy, again, who I think at points last year was the Orioles' best reliever in that bullpen. Yeah, I think I would pay $4 million to bring Danny Coulombe back. Even if he gets injured again, if he can give you 25 or 30 more innings, that is completely worth $4 million, especially with how well he pitches. Like, to compare it to a reliever who got a 1-year, $4 million contract this last year, Ryan Stanek. Ryan Stanek, a fine middle reliever. He's no Danny Coulombe. Coulombe is absolutely, no question about it, a no-brainer to pick up that option for $4 million. That should absolutely be happening. Now, the next question is can he stay healthy? And maybe some of the issues were just small sample stuff. And I think the Orioles with Gregory Soto and Cionel Perez and Keegan Aiken, like they have a strong group of other lefties in that bullpen. But if Danny Coulombe's healthy, I still think he is the top guy. He is the number one lefty in that bullpen if he can just stay on the field. So that's certainly going to be a question. And you're always worried, again, when it comes to those elbow issues that he had. And listen, he's 35. Now, he doesn't throw 97, but so maybe that's less stress on the elbow. But he's 35 years old. And it's harder for relievers to stay in the game when they get into their late 30s. And I think the final question is, will he make any kind of changes to his pitch mix? I mentioned the kitchen sink approach, the 5 different pitches, the sweeper, the sinker, the four-seamer, the cutter, and the knuckle curve. But we talked about with the cutter being his most used pitch each of the last 2 years, but it got hit hard last year. He threw it less and less as the season went on. Now, I don't think he's going to scrap the cutter. It's a pitch that he kind of created with the Orioles. It helped him. 2 years ago, he was able to throw it wherever he wanted for a strike. He threw it 42% of the time. Like, he might throw it less. He's certainly not going to get rid of it in his arsenal. It's still going to be an important, at least get me over strike one pitch for him. But I think we could see Danny Coulombe maybe throw some less cutters and throw some more sinkers. He threw a lot more sinkers in 2023. Maybe he goes back to that. And I know there is some issues with his velocity when he came back from the elbow injury. Like, he's usually 89 to 91 up to 92 with his fastballs. He was more 88-ish up to 89 with his fastballs in September after the injury. And maybe it's less of an issue for a guy who already throws 90. If he's throwing 88, yeah, it's a difference, but is it a huge difference versus a guy who was throwing 98 and is now throwing 95? That's usually a big difference. He knows how to pitch with 90. That tells me he'll know how to pitch with 88 or 89. That doesn't concern me as much. But less velocity is less velocity and generally will lead to a little bit less effectiveness, especially for a relief pitcher. So for now, it's worked. Everything's worked for now. But again, he's 35. And I think that's just another question, like velocity down, injury history, guys seeing him more and more. Can it continue to work? I think it can. I think Danny Coulombe is the kind of guy, the clubhouse culture, the injuries he's come back from, the fact that he's a veteran, the fact that he already has this like old man style pitch mix out there and is having success with it. I think he's a guy who could adapt again multiple times. It could pitch till he's pushing 40, to be honest with you. And at the very least, he can pitch one more effective season for $4 million for the Orioles in 2025. So even though there are more questions about Coulombe this offseason than there were last year when he was coming off an amazing 2023, bring him back, get him in that bullpen. He will help the Orioles get outs and get big outs next year. That'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow, unless we get some Orioles news. I'm expecting some sort of Orioles news here somewhat soon that they should start to kind of fill these coaching vacancies. Of course, we'll have those covered here on the pod, but we'll also continue these player review episodes throughout the week as we are back tomorrow here at Locked On Orioles. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.